You know how sometimes you will just read a comment and go, you clearly just straight up didn't watch the video? This is what happened last time I made a video about Critical Role. Everyone got mad because they thought I was criticizing their group, not the other group, which is the bad group. An algorithm knows I love polarizing people for literally no reason. So today, we're going to ask ourselves the question, does Critical Role roleplay wrong? If you are not a person deranged with unreasonable hatred for online dice rolling the show, you might be asking yourself, what does that mean to roleplay wrong? What is he saying? But it is a claim that, believe it or not, I do see flying around more often than I really feel I should be seeing it. People take immense issue with the way that they play the game, specifically the way that they roleplay at the table, to the extent that they think it is somehow incorrect. On the other hand, I have seen in the wild actual real people who think that if you don't roleplay in the way that Critical Roleplay, you are not role-playing right, and every group needs to do it that exact way, which is of course also absurd. Personally, I really like their style of roleplay. I think it's very engaging, it makes the show fun to watch, and whenever I see people roleplaying in a similar way in games that I am in, very often, it'll also drastically improve them as players. Not always. They're very clear that it's not always the case. But if we were to try to emulate them, what would we steal? Now, the most important thing, I think, this kind of should be a thing that everybody does. I mean, I don't like to be prescriptive in this kind of thing, but they're actually playing interesting characters. And by interesting, I do not mean cool, which a lot of people seem to confuse for interesting. By interesting, I mean they feel like real people because they are complex. They're not just a race, a class, and a background. They actually put a lot of thought into the backstory of the character and how it shaped them as a person. Now, quality definitely trumps quantity. You can have 25 pages of backstory with an addendum of statistical analysis as to how much your character jacked off during various periods of time in their life, and it can still be an unfathomably shit and boring character. The characters in Critical Role, they have their own values and ethics. They believe certain things about the world. They have the idiosyncrasies in their personal opinions, and they believe these things whether they're true or not. All the characters have secrets that only the GM and that individual player know about, and they have the discipline not to tell the other players those secrets as players, which, let me tell you, does take quite a bit of discipline. Secrets are very cool, but of course if you play a secretive character, you don't get to tell the other people about all the cool shit that happened to you, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. As an example, in a game group that I am in right now, right, my character's father, with whom he has a very problematic relationship, is a high-ranking military official in the foreign empire that they're trying to traverse without too much notice at this point in the campaign. And because my character is very secretive, he hasn't told the other characters this. And recently we had a situation where somebody told me, yeah dude, you really remind me of this high-ranking general that I know that has the same surname as you, which I of course as the NPC don't know because you presented yourself to me under a false identity, which you got yourself explicitly so your father wouldn't find you, but the other characters know your surname, so they would be able to make that connection. This might have resulted in whispers. This would have been a very interesting bit of foreshadowing to the other characters, and who then would have had a great cool reveal later. The problem is, I couldn't keep my mouth shut over this, so the players all know. So it's not nearly as interesting. The characters on Critical Role also seem to have unanswered questions about themselves. Jester doesn't know who her father is, Ford doesn't really know all that much about his warlock patron. They have the kind of relationship to their GM where they trust that GM to give them interesting answers to those questions during play. They also trust that their GM has their best interest in mind. All of the characters are also inherently flawed. They have things that they are bad at, which they still need to do sometimes. Because confronting the things that you are bad at is a very key element of storytelling when it comes to character development. They have fears and insecurities that they struggle and often fail to overcome. They're often emotional and irrational. They don't act in the best interest of the group and often not in the best interest of themselves, because that's how humans are. Or, you know, various fantasy species. You know what I mean. And if you've played RPGs for a while, you know that characters which are this well developed are actually rather rare. Most of the time, the characters you do get either are on the non-character end of the spectrum, or on the just a fuck ton of background but still absolutely no depth end of the spectrum. You know, the shonen protagonist, warrior, super wizard, rogue type person who at 18 has sailed around the entire world twice and killed the superworm death dragon of doom end of the world destroyer, and also the megalich super duper king oppressor tyrant of all of the parallel universes that exist, and also he is the leader of the High Emperor of Goddistan's personal honor guard. That's not an interesting character, that is a power trip, and unfortunately, I have to say, from experience, the kinds of players who play those kinds of characters tend to hog the spotlight. Which is how we get into the beat by beat at the Critical Role playing table. 7 players is a lot of players. That is a very high number of players to have at your table. And occasionally, they even have guests, which means more players. But the players at the Critical Role table do not hog the spotlight. They are completely fine being in the background for a while, not even being in the scene at all, and still paying attention to what's going on because they're actually interested and invested in the other characters. They don't need to constantly show off all the cool things their character can do. They don't need to constantly prove how cool and interesting their character is. They have great trust that the GM and the other players will rotate the spotlight around, and eventually at one point the sun will shine on them and it'll be their turn to do their thing that they're good at. Or that they're not good at, which can be just as interesting. They also trust that none of the other players will burst in to take their spotlight away from them while they have it. There's entire story arcs lasting several sessions where it's more about one character than any of the others. But that's fine because the players know that their characters will also have a place in that story and that eventually the party will come around to working on their personal story. They also play in a way that actually allows them to develop meaningful relationships with the other characters. For instance, Caleb is a loner character, which is completely fine. He has over time come to trust the other people in the party. He entered play already trusting one of the other characters over all the others, which created some very interesting social dynamics and conflicts. The character doesn't extricate himself from the social fabric of the group, he is an integral part of it because that's where all the interesting shit happens. It leads to conflict, it leads to tenderness, it leads to resolution, catharsis, all of those different parts of the human experience among the characters, which also leads me to probably the most crucial element in the actual play-by-play at the table at Critical Role. Yes, and I don't know if all of the players are actually explicitly trained as improv actors, but if you are an actor who has received any kind of training, part of that training will have been improv. And the underlying principle of improv is yes and. I made a whole video about how you should apply this in conversations too a while ago. I am literally just now remembering this. A lot of the time what I see happening at the gaming table is that players will create conflict for the sake of creating conflict, because they think that if you have conflict between characters, that constitutes good roleplay. And so what they do is they will just take anything that another character says and say no. Their approach is always no, but. And sometimes it's just only no, but let's, you know, get the good version and say no, but. Which intuitively may seem like a good option to create some degree of conflict, but it's actually not that great improv. With yes and, you don't deny another player's contribution to the creative brainstorming flow at the table. You twist it in your own way and add your own thing to it. There's also the very important understanding that when you do have some kind of conflict, the goal that you both have as players is for the characters to somehow resolve that conflict, but to not do it immediately. You don't get this when you just say no to everything and never budge. That's basically just stalling, and stalling is boring. But wait, I hear some people say, if you go into this interaction with the goal of creating a solution for the conflict, that's metagaming. To which I have to say, yes. And? Now, some people wouldn't call this metagaming at all, because metagaming must always be a bad thing, but I personally believe that you can absolutely classify it as metagaming, and that metagaming gets a very bad rap. This is to, like, the extent that players will have their characters do the exact opposite of what would be the good thing to do in order to have an interesting story, because if you do the thing that would lead to an interesting story, that would be metagaming, and metagaming is immediate capital punishment. I think that metagaming is essential to playing a satisfying game. And of course I don't mean you should read the Monster Handbook and then have your character know all of the things there. That's boring. I'm saying you should have an active interest in seeing an interesting story being told, and you should understand the basics of how that happens. And there are, certain theories of psychology that humans have an inherent understanding of storytelling, and I do find that especially people who, are a bit nerdy, which are the kinds of people who do play role-playing games a lot, will have an inherent understanding for how storytelling works, and they will use this understanding to make sure that doesn't happen, because that would be metagaming. They will see an obvious plot hook and do anything they can to avoid it. They will go to any lengths, because that would mean you are being railroaded, and this is a sandbox where you're supposed to be able to do anything you want, which is absolutely true. But also, this will just result in you doing nothing, because as much as we are telling a story in a sandbox, we are still telling a story, and that is very important to understand. We are, all of us at the table together, not just the GM, but all of the people sitting here telling a story collaboratively. And a very crucial aspect of that, because it's essentially a group project, is that in a group project, you communicate. Now, this is my personal speculation, of course, but I do highly suspect that they will give Matt Mercer a heads up on what the party plans to do next between sessions in the overarching story, and they also probably inform him where they would be interested in seeing their character arcs go. This all can change during play. A lot of interesting and unexpected things happen. That's part of the fun of the game, but if you communicate these things to the game master can come up with interesting sessions that are tailored to what you want to see and give you the material to make a good story. I shouldn't have to say this, but we live in a world where I do have to say this. You should want the GM to prep a good game. Look, I know, I understand that the reason you will avoid communicating with your GM about your intentions at any cost is because you're traumatized by shit GMs. I fully understand that. I see a lot of people being very, very careful around anything that a GM does or introduces to the world, because their immediate assumption is always that he's trying to trick us and kill us. That's what's happening here. And I'm not gonna lie to you, there are GMs who absolutely do this, and they are terrible. A good GM is just as invested in your character as you are, maybe even more so. They should be the character's biggest fan. They want to see them struggle. They want to see them overcome obstacles and have interesting things happen to them throughout the course of their adventure. That doesn't mean just giving them anything and everything that they want and always letting them get away with shit and protecting them from death and even the most weird of circumstances. Tragedy is an essential part of any good story, and the people at Critical Role trust Matt Mercer to provide this for them. They trust that he will never put them in a situation that they cannot under any circumstances escape, and he will never put anything in front of them that they can't handle. I mean, unless, of course, it's all the time that he does this. But he does it in a way, and they know this, that it will make for an interesting encounter, but won't outright kill them, unless that's just how things develop in a very unfortunate way. And once again, there will be people who say that the GM being anything but an unforgiving bastard is metagaming and evil. And to those people I say, no. But I can see that there is a culture of very antagonistic relationships between GMs and players. All you have to do is look at memes relating to the role-playing space to know that that is the case. Another bit of communication that I of course don't know whether this happens or not, but I have seen it suggested as a general piece of play advice anyway, is that the individual players at that Critical Role table will maybe outside of the game talk to each other and go, you know, I really like where our characters are individually right now, and it would be cool if we had one of those heart-to-heart scenes that we have sometimes, and maybe we could talk about this. They don't script out the conversation, they might not even have an opportunity to have that conversation at all. But the people involved can have a few thoughts ahead of time, so they have some interesting seeds that they can use to improv of. They have an improv conversation about it that they try to lead to an interesting conclusion, and of course they don't know the conclusion ahead of time because that's how improv works. This doesn't mean the show is scripted, it means that the players communicate and understand the rules of good improv. It also means that in moments of improv, characters might act a little inconsistently. They might go against their usual character, they might compromise on beliefs that you wouldn't expect they would compromise on in the interest of the group. This is good. Real people are extremely inconsistent. They are in a constant state of flux. It's a constant back and forth and compromising and whatever principles here, ethics, rationalizations, all of that shit. And if you play a character this way too, it makes them feel like a real person. Now, of course, improv is a very, very deep topic. There's a lot of nuance in how you can do it, and I highly encourage you to dive into it deeper now that you have heard about some of the basics. And it should be noted that all of the players at that table are extremely good at improv. They are world-class elite at that shit. They are in fact so good at improv that they know when to ignore the rules of improv and how to deal with someone ignoring the rules of improv. Not to mention they know each other very well, and they have for quite some time. It's a lot easier to talk to people if you understand their individual quirks and characteristics. And there's an additional layer to this, because as you play more and more with these characters, you understand your own characters' quirks and characteristics more, and also the quirks and characteristics of the other characters. You've gotten to know them, and you have come to develop an understanding for them as people. And all of these are very important things to consider when trying to take some of the tricks out of the toolbox of Critical Role for your own game. You cannot expect a group of people who don't really know each other, don't really know each other's characters, and are not all trained and experienced improv actors to play like Critical Role, even if you use all of the tools. You don't even have to do all of the tools. You don't have to do voices either. A lot of people are not comfortable doing voices, or they're not good at doing voices, or The worst case scenario, they're not good at doing voices, but very comfortable doing voices. You don't have to have deep, tender friendships or romance at the table, which, as far as I understand it, they have romance between characters where the players are not the players that are married to each other, but like different players in that group are married to each other. I'm not entirely clear on the social dynamics. It is important that you find the playstyle that works for your particular group. There are groups where all they like and all they want to do is numbers. To them, a character is just a collection of stats, and they use those stats to solve problems and duke it out with other collections of stats. Sometimes players will play characters without even any sort of alter ego that is a different person from them or a person at all. Some people don't like doing that. I don't want to play with those people. I think that playstyle is boring and tedious, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean they're not allowed to play that way with other people who enjoy playing that way. I personally care a lot more about the characters, the character interactions, and the story beats, the pacing, all of that stuff, which is why I prefer playing Dungeon World and City of Mist and the Storyteller system, because those are more focused on applying rules to the conversation instead of the game world. I like the way Critical Role plays. I like the way that they interact with each other, the way that they understand that they're all directors of the same story, while at the same time being the actors that play the protagonists of that story. I personally like that it is considered the gold standard of good roleplay because it is rather close to my own playstyle, maybe a little bit too much slapstick, but honestly, you know, that's fine. It's fine to play different. Every single individual table has a different playstyle, and that's really what you need to figure out, is how you and the people around you want to play. And sometimes people are just not compatible to play in the same groups. But in order to discover these things, you always need to communicate. No matter what kind of game table that you have, you need to communicate your expectations and your wants and desires to the other players, because if you don't, people will go in there with very different views of what should be happening, and then bad things will happen that might lead to like real world conflict, and that's bullshit that shouldn't really have to do with the RPG table. So, to answer the question, is Critical Role role-playing wrong? The opposite is true. In my opinion, they're doing it right. It is, after all, the way that I prefer role-playing in role-playing games. But I also think that the only way to actually play RPGs wrong is if you're not having fun. And that's the trick. You need to figure out where you fit in all that huge spectrum of different playstyles that are possible. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, I do wonder how often because I look into the lens of the camera when I do this, how often I actually point at H.P. Lovecraft's short story collection, which I can assure you, I am not nearly as racist. And see you around, cunts.